Actually, what we are going to talk about today is basically simple things. Okay? Simple things. However, it is also some important biology. Now, in the previous lesson, we talked about the control of respiration or the control of gaseous exchange, how the rate of gas exchange is controlled. Okay? We talked about it in the previous lesson. So, as you are controlling the rate of breathing in and out, okay, we saw the role of the medulla oblongata, to be specific, the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata that has two centers, the inspiratory and the expiratory center, that when they are stimulated by the receptors in the carotid and aortic bodies, and then also receptors in the medulla oblongata, they can lead to increasing the rate of respiration. Ventilation rate, you breathe in deeply and you breathe out deeply. Yes, like I've told you, we saw how the rate of respiration can be controlled. And as you are controlling the rate of respiration, then you are controlling the amount of carbon dioxide vis-a-vis oxygen in blood. So it has a direct connection with what we talked about previously. So carbon dioxide and oxygen in the tissues or in the body must obviously be maintained. It's not that you should have excess. It's not that they are respiratory gases, that they should just be excess. No, they should be maintained. Otherwise, if they are not, then the effects will be manifested. Yes, they do not have a direct effect on the tissues. They do not have a direct poisonous effect on the tissues, but rather, yes, the effect may be indirect, but it's there. Okay? And mainly involuntary. Now, the control of these gases is mainly involuntary. You're not aware of it. You have no conscious control of it. It is mainly involuntary and it is regulated by the medulla oblongata. So when you remember in coordination when we studied the role of the medulla oblongata, where we saw that one of them is control of involuntary activities in the body. So here is one of them. So how do we control? It is the same process like how we discussed the control of respiration. But now the other time we just dwelled on respiration. But also here the control of carbon dioxide together with oxygen involves different mechanisms, different systems. Whereby one is the respiratory system, like how we can see. Two, the transport system too is involved. So as you are controlling the rate, the rate of respiration, then you also affect the transport. You need to affect the anyway, we are going to see how the rate is controlled, how the rate is determined. So let's talk about the effects of changing the carbon dioxide and oxygen concentration. There is an effect. It's not that it's no. Yes, they are not that harmful, but when they are in excess, they can have an impact. Whereby in low concentration of oxygen, then the body must must find ways of obtaining that oxygen. And oxygen, and if the oxygen is low, then carbon dioxide must be high because you use oxygen and you produce carbon dioxide. So when oxygen concentration is low, then carbon dioxide is high. And so what happens? The carbon dioxide is going to be detected either by the chemoreceptors in biotic bodies, we talked about them, or the pH sensors in the medulla oblongata. And so when they detect, then you have to increase the rate of ventilation. Either expiration, you push out much carbon dioxide, okay? And then you enter or you push in more oxygen, okay? So that you balance. That means that the need either for oxygen is high and you have consumed a lot of it. So you increase the rate of ventilation. Number 2, the cardiac output. This one is the volume of blood that is pushed out by the heart in one single minute. So the volume of blood that is pushed out by blood in 1 minute increases. So that you push in blood to the tissues to pick the carbon dioxide that is high there, and then you push much blood to the respiratory system, to the lungs, to pick up oxygen from there, and then you expel much carbon dioxide to outside the body. So by increasing the cardiac output, one, the volume of blood increases, the pressure increases, and so the velocity increases. So that the oxygen is going to be supplied to the body tissues at a high rate. Also, at a high rate to meet the energy demands, or to meet the oxygen demands, leave the energy demands. Then you are going to have vasodilation and increased permeability of arterioles. Arterioles are not permeable, but the blood capillaries. So dilation means increasing in diameter. Then constriction means decreasing in diameter. Okay? The arteries, the arterioles, they do dilate. Now, you know that arteries have a narrow lumen. Narrow lumen. Why do they have a narrow lumen? So that the pressure is high. So that the velocity, the speed at which blood is going to move through these arterioles is high. So when they dilate, then they will allow large volumes. Remember, the heart is pumping large volumes of blood. So they do have to dilate to allow large volumes of blood to pass through these arterioles to the respiring tissues to supply the oxygen that is at high need, and then take away the carbon dioxide that is accumulating in the tissues to the lungs for expiration. So all that, it happens within your body, but involuntarily. You're not aware of it. Then high concentration of oxygen and low concentration of carbon dioxide during lack of enough in the tissues, then so by this one means all this, it will lead to an increase in oxygen in the tissues and a decrease in carbon dioxide in the tissues. Now, lack of oxygen in the tissues, the condition is known as hypoxia or anoxia. Okay? So the hypoxia is here, though you cannot see it because of this. Or you can call it anoxia. And it causes the following to happen. How do you know that you have less oxygen or your body needs more oxygen? Okay? How does the body respond, or how is it going to respond to that? So number one, the condition is known as hypoxia, or anoxia, and the following condition happens, or the following happens. Number one, you feel unconscious. Hmm? You generally don't understand yourself, and generally your body is weak, it is sluggish, okay? And you have impaired vision, you cannot see clearly, you just see blurred images. You can't read simple things, you can't see people who are a bit far. So you have impaired vision. Generally you have paralysis, muscle paralysis. Now why all this? Remember, one chief function of oxygen is to bring about aerobic respiration. It's okay guys, it's okay guys. So you know that one chief function, one role of oxygen is aerobic respiration. Okay? Now what is aerobic respiration? Yes, you know that aerobic respiration produces energy, and it's energy that is responsible for all this. Vision, you know, energy is involved. Paralysis, nervous impulse transmission, energy is involved. So in other words, in limited supply of oxygen, then your body lacks energy. Okay? And so the following happens. You feel headache. Okay? You feel generally your muscles are fatigued. Okay? Generally you are weak. Eh? Raising your arm becomes an issue. Raising your foot, moving becomes an issue. You feel like vomiting. Okay? And all that. So when all that happens, then you just find ways of. And actually, some people they even do faint. Boom. They even go ahead and faint. So that's when, if you see this, then you know that somebody is struggling with oxygen. Then if that, then the oxygen concentration, if it exceeds, like I told you, know that yes, we need oxygen, but also it shouldn't exaggerate. Okay? It shouldn't exceed the normal levels. So if it exceeds normal levels, obviously it's not good. Usually, if you are in areas with high oxygen content beyond the normal levels, you know, air must have 20%, 21% oxygen. So you are in a given area where the partial pressures of oxygen are even beyond 21%. Then it means your body will be first to take in air that is rich in oxygen. And it's not good. And the condition is known as hyperoxia. The other one was hypo. Hypo means under. So hypoxia. This here is derived from oxygen. But hyper means too much. So hyperoxia. Okay? This is oxygen is too much. Even remember with long-sightedness and short-sightedness. The other one was hyperomyopia or hyperopia. Then the other one was myopia. You remember? So this is hypoxia. Oxygen is under normal. Hyperoxia. Oxygen is above normal. So what happens is when oxygen is above normal, then the rate of metabolism is going to be so high. So high. Oh, because oxygen is enough, then you have to use the oxygen. Then the same, a high concentration, when oxygen is extremely high, then the enzymes responsible for Krebs cycle they are inhibited. Okay? And hence the tissue respiration is broken down. You break down the rate of respiration. And so, but remember, it is still high. Okay? So it will still increase in blood. So the increase leads to what we call pulmonary and ocular toxicity. So this one has to do with the lungs, and this one has to do with vision. That's why you saw up that a high concentration of oxygen leads to impaired vision. And the symptoms include disorientation, respiratory problems, and myopia. You just see things which are close to you, but you cannot see things which are far from you. Then you know that oxygen becomes too much. Then it will cause slight irritation of the trachea, the windpipe. It gets irritated. Then you have some mild cough, and then breathing becomes quite painful. And if it persists, then cough becomes uncontrollable. That you feel tightness in the chest, difficulty in breathing, shortness of breath, and if exposure is continued, you can even die. You can even die because of oxygen poisoning. Too much oxygen. Okay? So it's not a joking that yes, we need oxygen, so we should have, no. It should be regulated. Even when you are the doctor, yes, you are the doctor. A patient comes and the patient needs oxygen. It should be regulated. Don't just give. It should be regulated. Otherwise, if you just give and it's too much, then you can end up killing a patient. Okay? Then if oxygen is too much, it can end up damaging the cell membrane. And if you damage the cell membrane, you lose the 3D, you oxidize the proteins in the cell membrane, and then you lose the 3D shape of the membrane. Now if you lose the membrane, then what will happen? The cells. You lose cells. Okay? So how is it controlled? The same applies to how carbon dioxide is controlled. The same way carbon dioxide, the same way respiration is controlled. If you remember, that is the same way oxygen is going to be controlled. So since it must be maintained constant, then rise above normal, the chemoreceptors in the aortic and the carotid bodies, or in the carotid and aortic bodies, you remember, you know the carotid artery, that artery which supplies the head region with blood. It has some swellings, and in those swellings, you have their chemoreceptors which monitor blood that is passing through them. Then you have the aorta, just as the aorta is at the base of the aorta. In fact, you also have another swelling, and these two swelling, this is an aortic body and this is a carotid body. So these two bodies, they do have chemoreceptors which detect the levels of carbon dioxide vis-a-vis oxygen. So when carbon dioxide is high, then you determine the inspiratory center is activated or is stimulated, which brings about inspiration. You breathe in enough oxygen. Okay? Similarly, even when oxygen is high. So when the levels rise above normal, then the chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies will detect and fire nerve impulse to the respiratory center and the cardiovascular center. All these two centers are in the medulla oblongata. Now the respiratory center is responsible for breathing in and out, but the cardiovascular center is responsible for increasing the heart rate. So the heart pumps at a high rate so that you increase the cardiac output and the beats per minute by the BPM. If you can try it out, there are phones which can detect. You measure your heartbeat before jogging, and then you measure your heartbeat during jogging and after jogging. You get totally different values. Before you it will be in between 70 to 64 there up to 80 there BPM, beats per minute. But when you start jogging, you find when it's in 120 BPM, beats per minute. And then after jogging, it is around 100 there, 90 there BPM. Why? You increase the cardiac output, the volume of blood that is given out, so that you supply enough oxygen and enough nutrients, that's glucose, required for these cells, for the skeletal muscles to contract and produce energy. So what is responsible for that? It is the cardiovascular center. Even when you are running, if you are in a race, you feel like the rate at which you are breathing, it's so high. And it is involuntary. You have no control over it. Okay? So there are these two centers in the medulla oblongata that are responsible for that. Then the respiratory center sends impulse via the efferent nerves to the diaphragm. We saw that this is the phrenic nerve. And then the intercostal muscles, we saw that this is the intercostal nerve, where they will cause in contraction to bring about inspiration. Then the cardiovascular center, it will send the same impulse via the efferent nerve to the heart and arterioles, whereby in the heart you will increase the heart rate, the rate at which the heart pumps. Okay? But in the arterioles, they will dilate so that they create a large passage for this large volume of blood, so that you supply enough, okay, enough to meet the high energy demand. Okay? And all this happens without your conscious awareness. So therefore, if the question says, describe how carbon dioxide levels are maintained, you talk about all this. And it's the respiratory center and the cardiovascular center that are responsible for that. Describe how oxygen levels are concerned, are regulated or are maintained. Same issue. Describe how the or breathing mechanism, ventilation rate is maintained or is regulated or is controlled. The same. And stuff like that. Okay? Yes. So guys, any queries before we talk about altitude and acclimatization? Yeah, that was really a nice review. That was really good. It was amazing. So now, for my mountain climbers here, this is for you. Hmm? You know, there are people who do mountain climbing as a game. But you are all aware that a mountain like Renzoni, with its highest peak called Margarita, I think. That's what I was taught in P3. Actually, let me give you this. This is a life experience. In my high school, we visited Renzoni, where we were able to see, we were able to climb, and it was fun. But we just went up to the first peak, and they told us but it has 8 peaks, something of that kind. But we moved for the whole day. Imagine we started moving at 7, we reached, was it Lake Mahoma? Some lake up. We moved for almost 8 hours to reach there, and other 8 hours of coming back. So it was really a nice experience. Why didn't we just move once? Boom! In 1 minute, boom, you are there. Why do you just do it slowly? Even with these mountain climbers, for you to move up to Maragarita, you can't move in 1 day. You move and then you station somewhere, then move, station somewhere, station somewhere, station somewhere, station somewhere until. Why do you have to do that? Unless you've carried oxygen cylinders and stuff like that. Then you have to move. Otherwise, if you just move, then that's when somebody talked about the the altitude sickness, or the climber's disease, or the mountain disease, whichever way you call it. I think it is the best way, the best name is altitude sickness. So, as altitude is gained, obviously the partial pressures of oxygen, the atmospheric pressure decreases. So, as we move up, as you climb up, then the atmospheric pressure decreases. That's why I think it's around senior 3. You were senior 3 physics. You were asked this question, that boiling water in the valley and boiling water on top of the hill, where does water boil first? And the answer was boiling on top of the hill. Good enough we are studying physical chemistry. You all know that now for you to boil, then the vapor pressure must be equivalent to the atmospheric pressure. You know that perfectly well. Okay? So, on top of the hill, the atmospheric pressure is lower than the sea level, or below the sea level. So because of that, then it would, on top of the hill, it will boil easily, or the vapor pressure will equate the atmospheric pressure easily, because the atmospheric pressure is low, than at the sea level. So basically that's, if you understand that concept, then it's cool. So as we ascend above the sea level, then the atmospheric pressure keeps on decreasing, decreasing, decreasing. But that doesn't affect just atmospheric pressure. But if you decrease the atmospheric pressure, then the partial pressures of these gases is also affected. Okay? It does not only affect the atmospheric pressure, but the decrease in atmospheric pressure decreases the partial pressures of these gases. And oxygen is part. Now, when you decrease the partial pressures of these gases, then the volume is therefore going to be less at high altitude than on the sea level. So therefore, it becomes hard for a person who has been living on the sea level to live at high altitude. Why? Because for you are adapted. You are adapted to live on areas that are at lower altitude. You cannot live. You are adapted in living areas with high oxygen concentration. Okay? Than living in areas with low oxygen partial pressure. So therefore, if you abruptly ascend above the hill, from nowhere, boom, you ascend above the hill, then you're going to experience anoxia. Okay? Anoxia and hypoxia. Because you are not adapted to living in such areas of low partial pressures of oxygen. So what will happen then? Then you have headache, or the condition is you're going to feel headache, you're going to feel nausea, confusion. I don't know how you become confused, fatigue, and unconsciousness. Okay? And this condition is what is referred to as the climber's disease or the mountain sickness or the altitude sickness. Altitude or mountain sickness. Altitude or mountain sickness. That is if you boom, generally you are on low altitude, but you from nowhere you ascend, okay, and you are on the high altitude because you adapted to live in such areas of high partial pressures of oxygen. Then you cannot survive in such areas with low partial pressures of oxygen. Not so? Yes. But obviously such symptoms are going to disappear because the body do adjusts. Okay? Our bodies can adjust. We have that adaptability factor. We can adjust to survive in such areas of low partial pressures of oxygen. And that process of adjustment is what we call acclimatization. Okay? That process of adjustment. Those physiological changes that your body undergoes in order to suitably live in such an area with low partial pressures of oxygen, we call them acclimatization. And they include number one, the amount of hemoglobin and the red blood cells in a single unit of blood increases, or in your blood increases. Hemoglobin increases. Okay? And the number of red blood cells also increase. Why? So that you can pick enough oxygen, you can pack and transport enough oxygen even at low partial pressures of oxygen. And as if that's not enough, leave the amount, but also the affinity. We studied this as far as transport is concerned when we studied the ODC, the oxygen dissociation curve. The affinity for oxygen, the hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen increases. Okay? So that the hemoglobin can get saturated with enough oxygen even at very low partial pressures of oxygen. If we are to become more fancy or more technical, then that's when we shall say the ODC shifts more to the left. The oxygen dissociation curve shifts more to the left. Because the oxygen, the affinity, the hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen increases. And by doing so, you'll be able to extract, let me use that word, enough oxygen even at low partial pressures. That's why if you count the number of blood cells in a unit volume of blood in persons that live at the sea level and persons that live at high altitude, these two have totally different number of red blood cells in a unit volume of blood, maybe in 1 cc. Totally different. Why? Because these two are living in different environments with totally different challenges. Here the challenge is oxygen. You have enough, even more than enough. You have excess. And you have seen that excess is bad. But here, you just have little. Okay? You have no oxygen. The partial pressures are very low. So here you need a high number of red blood cells, and the concentration of hemoglobin must also be high. Even the hemoglobin unit must be high. But here, in fact, the curve shifts more to the right. So you can check on the ODC, the oxygen dissociation curve. Okay? Yes, if you haven't studied it, then we can also arrange a lesson and we talk about transport in animals. Okay? Transport in where? In animals. Where we shall be able to talk about all this. So that's brilliant. Uh-huh. The breathing rate increases the rate at which you're going to. The ventilation rate. And by the volume, the tidal volume also increases. If you remember, the tidal volume, inspiratory reserve, blah blah blah. The tidal volume increases. And the rate at which you're breathing in also increases. The cardiac output, together the rate of heartbeat increases. Okay? So that you can pump enough oxygen to the tissues. You can breathe in large volumes of air so that you extract enough oxygen regardless of the partial pressures being low. Then there is the kidneys, or the kidney cells secrete erythropoietin hormone. It is secreted by the kidney cells and it is stimulated by the low oxygen tensions in the body. And this one leads to an increase in the production of blood cells. So that you have enough red blood cells to transport enough oxygen throughout the entire body. So that you meet your oxygen demands. Not so? Yes. So how about during an exercise? Like I told you, we are here and you start jogging, jogging, and then you from jogging now you run. From running you run, you sprint. What will happen? Those observable changes. How will you feel? You start by the breathing rate will be right now you're not even aware that you are breathing. You're not even aware that the heart is pumping. But if you increase, then even the breathing rate is going to increase. Then when you increase, it becomes too much, too much, too much. And it happens uncontrollably. So what are the changes that are involved during a strenuous exercise? Meanwhile, let me check for your questions. Yeah, so no questions. Oh, thanks for those few questions. They are really good. So let's talk about the changes that do occur during a strenuous exercise. Now, during and even before the race, usually you prepare. Okay? You prepare. You can imagine. Here I use Usain Bolt. Eh? Bolt. The man with the world record. Do you know running 100 meters in just 9 point, is it 9.3? Or it is 8 point something? 9.56? You can find out. Seconds. Can you imagine? 100 meters. It means the speed that you are taking off is almost 10 point something. Roughly 11 meters per second. Can you imagine? 11 meters per second. It means in 1 second you are making 11 steps. 1 second is 11 strides, I mean. 1 second is 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2. Somebody has made 11 strides. 3, 4. Somebody has made 22 strides. Do you know how much? So you can imagine how much energy the guy uses and how much training the guy does, because he has to train. Their bodies are adapted to do that. That's why the Bolt who runs 100 meters cannot run a marathon. And that's why Kipchoge, if you know Eliud Kipchoge, the guy who runs a marathon, imagine running 40 kilometers, and the guy remains fresh, cool, kawa. 40 kilometers. Eliud Kipchoge cannot run a 100-meter race. Cannot. All their bodies are adapted differently. So you have to be adapted, and the body must prepare for that. Must be ready for that. So before the race, the cerebral cortex sends the nerve impulse to the sympathetic nerve, or to the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? So that you prepare. And the sympathetic nervous system responds by stimulating the adrenomedulla, not cortex, it is adrenomedulla. It can't be adrenomedulla cortex. If you remember, in coordination, this was just a mistake. You know the adrenal gland has both the adrenomedulla and adrenocortex. Now it is adrenomedulla that is responsible for releasing hormone epinephrine, or you can say adrenaline. Okay? So that is adrenomedulla. Then the adrenocortex is for corticosteroid hormones, the glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and aldosterone hormones. We studied all that as far as coordination is concerned. Now, the adrenaline, after releasing this adrenaline, this epinephrine, depending on which book you read, it's the one that prepares the body now to fly. For instance, Usain Bolt, the adrenaline towards the start, eh? Just before the start of a race, if you measure the adrenaline levels, if you measure the heartbeat, if you measure the breathing rate, even before the start, so higher than normal. The guy is frightened, the guy is panicking, pumping, focused, even before the start. Now, here, you can't attribute that to the strenuous exercise, that the body is under strain. No, the body is not, it has not yet performed any activity, but it is frightened. Why? Because of this hormone. And that hormone is good. It is the one that brings about those physiological changes that include increasing the ventilation rate, increasing the heart rate and the cardiac output, then constriction of the arterioles to organs that are to non-vital organs. Let me say that. For example, now you are going for a 100-meter race. Why should you supply blood to the digestive system? Why? To do what? To do what there? Hmm? Think about it. You are going for a 100-meter race. Why should you supply blood to the reproductive organs? To do what there? Don't be perverted. I've just said reproductive organs. To do what? So you constrict blood vessels that supply blood to non-vital organs, and then you dilate blood vessels that supply blood to vital organs in this case. In this case, the skeletal muscles, in this case, the heart, in this case, the brain, the liver, because you have to respire, break down glycogen, transport, so that you avail enough oxygen, enough nutrients, rate of respiration increases, produce enough energy. In fact, it should be a robust, a shunt of energy, okay? To be able to take off, because it is really taking off, okay? Then increase the rate of respiration, supply more energy that is going to be used. Then all the above, they lead to manufacture of energy in the skeletal muscles so that they rapidly contract, or you supply enough materials, that is oxygen and glucose, so that you increase the rate of respiration, produce more energy to bring about locomotion. And so you'll be able to succeed in your race. For instance, let's talk about the sprinters, the bolts. These are the sprinters, okay? Running a 100-meter race. They are not the same as those people who run a marathon. The two are different. So for the sprinters, the ATP molecules become used for contraction of muscles in the process of sprinting. Obviously, we saw the above. You have to be adapted, we saw, and you produce ATP. Now the ATP produced is going to be used up, okay? So to accommodate, to account for that, or to, yes, to account for that, then you have to increase the rate of metabolism in the skeletal muscles, whereby much glucose is broken down, but I prefer hydrolyzed, okay? Much glucose is hydrolyzed to produce energy, and now the energy is going to be used in muscular contraction to bring about that sprinting. So in the process, carbon dioxide is going to accumulate in the skeletal muscles, which will diffuse into the circulatory fluid, which is blood, lowering the pH. In other words, you increase the acidity of blood. So the decrease in the acidity, as blood is saturating through the medulla oblongata, then the receptors, the pH receptors, or the receptors that monitor pH of blood, they are stimulated, and then the chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies are also stimulated, which will lead to increasing the heart rate and the ventilation rate, so that you can supply the body with enough oxygen and enough nutrients. Then, because of an increase in metabolism, then the body temperature also increases. So as you are running also, then within the under the skin you have their stretch receptors. Okay? They are stimulated, and when they are stimulated, they will send the impulse to the cerebellum, which determines the extent of stretching. Okay? So that you don't overdo it, and in turn it controls, okay, the rate at which you're going to take off. And during the race, obviously, there's going to be the oxygen demand is going to increase due to drastic increase in the rate of metabolism. Now these are the marathoners. There is high metabolism, so the need for oxygen is going to be high than what you can supply to your body. So as a result, the body will resort to anaerobic respiration because the need is too much than what you can supply to the body. So because of that, then the lactic acid is going to accumulate, and if the lactic acid accumulates, then sometimes it can lead to fatigue, muscle muscle pain, muscle cramp, and muscle pulls. That is if you are not adapted to this. That is if you are not like you take Bolt to run a marathon. He cannot. Okay? But now these ones, the Kipchoges, the Kipsuros, the Cheptegeis, the muscles now are adapted to high levels of lactic acid. And so because of that, then they can persist. So accumulation of lactic acid in the muscle during the race, it won't remain, it won't stay. Now after the race, you obviously have to break down the lactic acid. You either break it down, feed it in glycolysis, and break it down and convert it and produce energy out of it. Or if energy is not required, then you break it down and convert it back into glucose, and then convert the glucose into glycogen you store. But that one occurs in the liver. And the process of removing, usually by oxidation, by breaking it down, is referred to as the oxygen death. That's why usually at the end of the exercise, you keep breathing heavily. You keep breathing heavily. Okay? So that you pay that oxygen debt, you take off or you remove the lactic acid from the body. Then accumulation of lactic acid in the body causes vasodilation of arterioles. Why? So that the rate at which blood moves, obviously blood moves in large volume and also moves at a high rate, is high to push out the carbon dioxide, and then you take in the oxygen for breakdown of lactic acid. Then temperature increases, which is regulated by sweating. You sweat to lose water of crystallization. So basically that's how we finish topic gaseous exchange. And I think it was really fun. But before you have this fact check, or it's a quick check, you can think about this. What's the difference between jogging and sprinting? And explain why a sprinter cannot run a marathon. A sprinter like Bolt, I'll still use Bolt, but there are many sprinters. That is if you like Olympics. You know, the Bolt and others, the Gathering, the and others, you know them. So why? But I like Bolt because of that world record, this guy. So a sprinter cannot run a marathon. Why? Think about that. So you can write an essay, okay? But it should be, you should write science, you should write biology, not English. So you can write an essay. Why do you think Bolt cannot run and at the same time a marathon guy cannot sprint, cannot run a 100-meter race? The two are adapted differently. So from what we have just discussed, you can add words up, you can add them and write a good essay. Okay? Yes. So like guys have suggested, we have finished gas exchange. So from gas exchange, we shall talk about homeostasis. And homeostasis means simply maintaining the internal environment constant. And it has something to do with coordination, because they are hormones that do maintain the internal environment. Hormones responsible for regulation of body metabolism. And body metabolism is responsible for maintaining the internal environment constant. And as you are maintaining the internal environment constant, then you are carrying out homeostasis. So basically, if you want to understand clearly our next topic, which is homeostasis, you can, I hope coordination is now part of it. So do some detailed, have some good understanding of coordination. All videos are there. You can watch through over and over again and get to understand. Then if you understand, then homeostasis is going to be cheap. Otherwise, let's subscribe, by the way. Let's all subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your students, those who are stranded. You never know, it might help them.